David Kelley, and he just gave an interesting talk on why you need philosophy, if I recall correctly. And
Yes.
so we missed the talk, so we want to get the essence of this talk for our viewers.
Okay, well, I'm talking to a group of students who are libertarians that are here from various schools with different majors, and they're involved in activism, persuasion, trying to convince people about the value of freedom and the benefits of freedom. So my point was, if you're going to do that effectively, you need to understand the philosophical bases, both for your own view and the basis of the views of people who don't agree with you, so you can reach them and reach them where they're coming from, not just browbeating them with arguments that don't speak to their issues. So what we did was to go through what some of the branches of philosophy are, what some of the core issues are, and then how they relate to freedom as a value, and in what ways when you come out in favor of a libertarian society, a free society, you are resting your approach on views such as that individuals have a right to live their lives as they choose. Why is that? Underlying philosophical idea, it's good, it's proper to pursue your self-interest. Now that's a big moral, ethical issue in ethical philosophy. That's egoism versus altruism, as the way it's framed in philosophy. Many people feel that it's not noble to live for yourself. It's more noble to live for others. You got to address that, or you're not going to be effective, because that's one of the issues that, for example, underlies why people support the welfare state. So that's the kind of point I made. I took a number of issues, and then I was trying to help them with a strategy of how you actually do identify the underlying philosophical views of someone that you're engaged in dialogue with.
Well, I want to interrupt you because you're giving a good speech. It's very interesting, but it reminds me of what I do with the Socratic interviewing technique, where I start to check the person's premises and see where they part company with me. Then I present what I consider to be evidence to show that that premise that they hold, that I disagree with, conflicts with another premise that they also hold.
Okay.
So there's a contradiction between
Right.
their premises, and they don't realize it.
Right.
And so, talking about the example you were saying about self-interest, I've been recently doing some debates with anarchists, and one of the problems that they have is that they haven't identified that fact that they should be the ultimate beneficiary of their actions. So they're quite willing to sacrifice themselves and not initiate physical force even under extreme duress, or you see, or they're willing to not pay a ransom note from a foreign tyrant that is saying either pay up or I'm going to nuke you, and they say, okay, well, we'll get nuked. No, I think you should pay. So if they had clear, like you were pointing out, I think it's a very good observation, very important and philosophically valid one for persuasion and arguing what your underlying premises are. So I know that I think I should be the ultimate beneficiary of my actions. So if he doesn't think so, then we have to start there and find out, we're on different pages at a very fundamental level.
Right.
And so a lot of the people, even though I do this, they don't seem to grasp why the hell I'm making these points.
Well, it's slow work, and it's not an easy task. People don't wear their philosophical premises on little cards.
You find out when you ask the questions.
You have to dig and explore and ask Socratic questions like you do. So that's exactly it, and I was trying to convey something to the students about how you might go about doing that, being what Ayn Rand called a philosophical detective.
Did you want to give a specific example that you think is your prime example to illustrate this point that you used in your talk?
Well, I gave it an exercise about the minimum wage, increasing the minimum wage, and you, the audience, you're as a libertarian, you're trying to say why you don't believe
Right.
in raising the minimum wage. And one example is you're talking with someone who just doesn't understand the economics, but doesn't have a value conflict with you, versus you're talking with someone who just hates the market because she thinks it's inherently exploitative, that profits are selfish, and profit motive is selfish, and profits are taken from workers. Someone who thinks that basically any commercial interaction between people, anytime I pay you for your time and work, I'm treating you as a commodity. And these were points that I brought out from two conversations that were very natural, the kind of thing most of us have had at one time or another. I was just saying how to be a detective and spot the verbal flags of an underlying philosophical assumption.
Let me throw this out. When I interview people on minimum wage, I often, they're in favor of raising the minimum wage, and one of my favorite questions is, do you believe in the law of supply and demand?
Mm-hmm.
And they say, well, yeah. So that is not too deep a
Right.
difference, because here's a person that at least on the surface grasps the economic
The economics of it, yes.
so you don't have to go down too deep. So I say, well, if you raise the price of labor, will you have less demand?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a problem.
Right. See, that's, if someone gets that, but, and in one of my examples, that's exactly, the guy responded, oh, right, okay. But with the more hostile person in the conversation, in the example of making exactly the same arguments with someone who's a little more hostile, it was, I don't know, it's beyond supply and demand. She doesn't like buying and purchasing labor. She doesn't like the fact that economic laws that apply to lettuce and cars are being applied to people.
You think she thinks it's degrading,
Yes.
insulting, and
Right.
beneath her, and she preferred to
And
starve.
that goes ultimately, well, it ultimately goes back to Marx. We should not have a market. Labor should not be in any way a commodity.
So how about this possible juncture where you can ask them, well, do you agree that people should relate based on mutual consent? That might be a common
You
ground.
can do that, yeah.
But she says no.
No, what she will say, what this woman would say, this wasn't actually part of the example, but would say is, well, workers are not laboring under consent. They're forced to take a job. They're forced to accept whatever wage the employer gives them. They have no choice. It's not consensual. So employers have all the power. They have none. So that's a different perspective on the way the world works.
and sometimes you can make the argument that somebody's in dire straits and their options are limited, but in generally speaking, people have plenty of options, and even in those cases, they do have some options, and the person who's offering them the job is actually saving their life.
Well,
Because
you know
if you're in dire life, so how can we, that knowledge that you and I share, how can we use it to convince her?
Well, one of my
you
my
prefer
last
to die?
being a philosophical detective was my first lesson about philosophy and persuasion. My last lesson was, you're not going to convince everybody. You know, as Kenny Rogers said, know when to hold them, know when to fold them.
Okay. You know, I'm glad you raised that, because I don't want our audience to miss the major point, which is the reason why we need philosophy is to know what to do in life.
Yeah.
So this is just one category that you were focusing on, which is persuasion,
Right.
arguing, campaigning, or whatever. But but that's really not, in the scheme of things, is not the most important reason why you need philosophy, right? You want to address the more magnum question, the major question.
Well, we need philosophy as individuals because we have lives to live and choices to make, and we need to know what's possible to human beings, what kind of world we're living in. Can we know and understand that world? Can we trust our minds? What values are worth living for? And what traits of character will best get us there? All of that is philosophy. And leaving aside politics altogether, you still have a life to live. And that's philosophy is, and you can't escape those philosophical questions. You may not think about them in a very rigorous way, but everyone has some outlook on those questions. And so really the only choice is not whether to have philosophy relevant to your guiding your life. It's how explicit and deliberate can you make that philosophy?
Excellent
how
point.
rational?
Excellent point, David. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much for the interview. And every so often I find my wife reading your book. It's a life of your own. So I say, hey, are you sure?
Very
Take
good.
care.